The grand facade of Oakwood Plantation gleamed under the relentless Alabama sun, its white columns standing as pristine sentinels against a backdrop of endless cotton fields. Eleanor Montgomery moved through this world of curated perfection with practiced grace, her silk skirts whispering across polished floors as she inspected the day's household accounts. To the neighboring ladies who took tea on her veranda, she was the picture of Southern aristocracy. Flawlessly composed, her smile never faltering as she discussed the harvest or the latest gossip from Montgomery. They saw only the delicate china, the shimmering silver, and the hostess whose life appeared as orderly as her manicured gardens. But behind Eleanor's serene blue eyes, a tempest raged. Each polite laugh, each measured comment about the weather, was a performance. Her mind was not on the sugar crystals dissolving in her cup, but on the silent, dusty space above her head, the attic. While her hands remained steady, folding a linen napkin with precision, her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Up there, hidden from the opulent world below, lived her two greatest secrets. Her children, Samuel and Eliza. Their existence was a stark, living contradiction to the pristine life she presented to the world, a truth that could shatter her world into irreparable pieces. Her husband, Robert, was a ghost at the edges of her life, a man more concerned with ledgers and yields than with the woman he had married. Theirs was a marriage of convenience and property, a union that provided the grand house and the social standing but left a cavernous emptiness in its wake. He spoke to her of cotton prices and the intransigence of the hands in the fields, his voice a dry monotone that never quite reached his eyes. Eleanor would nod, her responses automatic, her true self retreating further inward with each passing day. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lawn, the last carriage rolled away. The moment the sound of hoofbeats faded, the mask of the plantation mistress slipped. The silence of the great house felt heavy, accusatory. With the household staff occupied with evening chores, Eleanor's feet carried her on a familiar, furtive path. She glided past portraits of stern-faced ancestors, her movements silent and swift, a twist of a skeleton key in a lock hidden by an ornate tapestry, and she was ascending a narrow, creaking staircase, the air growing thick with the scent of old wood and confinement. Pushing open the heavy door, she entered their world. The attic was a stark contrast to the splendor below, a cramped space lit by a single grimy window, its floorboards bare. Two small figures, a boy and a girl, looked up from a quiet game with makeshift toys. Their eyes, a shade of hazel that mirrored her own yet held a different history, lit up at the sight of her. A wave of love, so fierce it was painful, washed over her, followed immediately by a corrosive tide of guilt. This was their life. A few stolen moments of tenderness in a hidden room, their voices hushed, their very existence a crime. She knelt, gathering them into her arms, their small bodies a fleeting comfort against the cold dread that had become her constant companion. Every visit was a risk, every soft word a potential betrayal, and as she held them close, Eleanor Montgomery knew the beautiful facade of her life was built on a foundation of secrets that could not hold forever. The narrow, twisting staircase felt like a passage between two separate worlds, each step upward a shedding of the plantation mistress's skin, each creak of the wood a potential alarm. Eleanor moved with the silence of a ghost, a wicker basket heavy with contraband clutched tightly in her hand. The air grew thick and hot, smelling of aged timber, dried lavender from the sachets she hid among the linens, and the faint, sweet scent of childhood that clung to her children. At the top, she paused, her ear pressed against the rough grain of the door, listening for any sound from the house below before fitting the key into the lock. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing the attic's dim interior. A slanted ray of late afternoon sun cut through the lone grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes that swirled like tiny fireflies. In this pool of hazy light sat Samuel and Eliza. The boy, 8 years old with a thoughtful brow and eyes that held a wisdom far beyond his years, was carefully arranging a collection of bottle caps into intricate patterns. His sister, 6, with curls that defied taming, was whispering to a rag doll, Its stitched smile faded from years of love. Their faces, a heartbreaking blend of her own fine features and their father's strong, gentle lines, turned toward her, and the quiet room seemed to brighten with their silent, radiant joy. Eleanor knelt, the rough floorboards scraping against her knees through the fine fabric of her dress. She unpacked the basket with a reverence usually reserved for church, laying out their treasures. Fresh biscuits wrapped in a cloth, slices of ham, 2 apples, and, most precious of all, a small, leather-bound book of fables. Samuel's eyes widened at the sight of the book, his small hands reaching for it with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Eliza immediately tucked a biscuit into the folds of her doll's dress, a quiet offering. The lesson began in whispers, a conspiracy of 3. Eleanor traced the shapes of letters on the dusty floor with her finger, her voice a soft murmur. Samuel followed with intense concentration, his own small finger mimicking her movements, his brow furrowed in effort. Eliza, less patient, leaned against her mother's side, her attention drifting to the sliver of world visible through the cracked window. She pointed a tiny finger toward the green expanse of the lawn, her whisper full of longing. "The birds fly so high," she breathed, her eyes fixed on the freedom of the sky. "Where do they go?" The question, so simple and innocent, struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. How could she explain a world of sun-drenched fields and open roads, of towns and rivers, when their entire universe was this single, dusty room? She faltered, her carefully prepared answers about safety and love crumbling to ash in her mouth. She could only pull Eliza closer, pressing a kiss to her curls, her silence a more profound and terrible answer than any words could be. For a moment, a fragile tenderness settled over them. Samuel read a halting sentence from the book, his voice proud. Eliza rested her head on Eleanor's shoulder, her breathing soft and even. It was a perfect, stolen sliver of peace, a family portrait painted in shadows. Then, the sound came, the unmistakable heavy tread of footsteps on the main staircase below, ascending. The spell shattered. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded Eleanor's veins. In a frantic, silent flurry, she moved. The book was snatched from Samuel's hands and thrust back into the basket. The crumbs from their meal were swept into her palm. She herded the children back into the shadows, her eyes wide with a silent plea for their silence. With a final, desperate look, she blew out the single candle, plunging the attic into near-total darkness. She slipped through the door, closing it with a soft, definitive click, the turn of the key in the lock echoing like a prison gate. On the other side, she was once again Eleanor Montgomery of Oakwood Plantation, her heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of her children clinging to her clothes like a ghost. The scent of magnolia blossoms and lady's perfume hung heavy in the afternoon air, a cloying sweetness that did little to mask the undercurrent of judgment flowing through the garden party. Eleanor Montgomery moved through the crowd with a fixed, porcelain smile, her gloved hand accepting a glass of lemonade she had no intention of drinking. The sprawling lawn of the Covington estate was a kaleidoscope of pastel silks and murmured pleasantries, a world of curated social harmony where every glance held meaning and every whispered word could be a weapon. She navigated the clusters of plantation wives and merchant husbands, her posture erect, her laughter timed perfectly to blend with the gentle hum of conversation. Yet her eyes, behind their veneer of calm, were constantly scanning, assessing, listening for the one discordant note that could shatter her carefully constructed reality. It came not as a shout, but as a sigh, a fragment of conversation caught on the breeze as she passed a group of women fanning themselves beneath a sprawling oak. From the Montgomery place, I swear it, a voice, thin and sharp as a needle, lanced through the air. Unnatural sounds, Carrie said. Like a child's cry carried on the wind from the wrong part of the house, Eleanor's steps faltered for a fraction of a second, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She forced her feet to keep moving, her smile never slipping, but the world around her seemed to tilt, the vibrant colors of the garden leaching into shades of gray. The words were not an accusation, not yet, but they were a seed, planted in fertile gossip and already beginning to sprout. "Eleanor, dear," You look quite pale." The voice of her friend Martha was a sudden anchor in the swirling dread. Martha stood before her, her kind face etched with genuine concern. "Is the heat troubling you? You've been so distant lately." Martha's gaze was too perceptive, her questions too direct. Eleanor felt the facade cracking under that friendly scrutiny. She could feel the weight of the secret pressing against her ribs, a physical burden that made it difficult to draw breath. She manufactured a light cough, bringing a lace handkerchief to her lips as a shield. "A slight headache, nothing more," she demurred, her voice a studied note of airy unconcern. The summer heat always takes its toll, but her eyes betrayed her, flickering nervously toward the edge of the garden where the enslaved servants stood waiting, their expressions carefully blank. Among them, she caught the gaze of a young woman who had once worked closely with James in the carpentry shed. The woman's eyes did not hold the vacant obedience of the others. They held a knowing depth, a silent communication that passed between them in a heartbeat before the woman looked down at her feet. It was a confirmation more terrifying than any gossip. The whispers were not confined to the parlors of the white elite. They were circulating through the quarters, a quiet, dangerous hum of suspicion that knew the truth of Oakwood's hidden heart. The journey home in her carriage was an eternity of imagined terrors. Every rustle in the tall roadside grasses seemed to hold a prying eye. Every call of a distant bird sounded like a warning. She sat bolt upright, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze scouring the landscape as if expecting a mob to materialize from the twilight. As Oakwood's familiar silhouette came into view, its white columns should have been a welcome sight, but tonight they looked like the bars of a gilded cage. Once inside, the grand house felt cavernous and hostile. She dismissed the housemaid with a wave of her hand, claiming exhaustion, and stood alone in the echoing foyer, her ears strained, listening for any sound from above. A footstep, a muffled laugh, anything that could betray the life hidden in the attic. The silence was somehow more menacing. Paranoia, a vine she had long nurtured in secret, now wrapped itself tightly around her heart, its thorns digging deep. Driven by a frantic, unreasoning fear, she found herself at the foot of the narrow staircase, a heavy iron lock and a new length of chain clutched in her trembling hands. The act of reinforcing the attic door was a futile gesture, she knew. A stronger lock would not silence the whispers on the wind, nor would it erase the knowing look in a servant's eye. But as she drove the new screws into the old wood, the metallic screech of violation of the house's quiet, it felt like the only thing left in her power to do. She was not just locking her children in. She was locking the rest of the world out, barricading herself inside a fortress of her own making, the chain a cold, hard symbol of her ever-tightening isolation. 5 years before the attic became a prison and the whispers began, the gardens of Oakwood were not a place of dread for Eleanor, but a sanctuary. The loneliness of her marriage had already taken root, a hollow ache that echoed through the grand, empty rooms of the house. Robert was more an absence than a presence, a man who communicated in ledgers and directives, his interest in his wife extending only as far as her ability to maintain his home and his reputation. Eleanor felt herself fading, becoming another beautiful, silent piece of furniture in the opulent museum of their life. Her salvation arrived in the form of a commissioned project, a new gazebo for the far corner of the garden, a place to catch the evening breeze. The man tasked with its creation was James, an enslaved worker whose skill with wood was renowned across the county. He was a quiet man, his movements economical and sure, his hands capable of coaxing impossible grace from rough-hewn timber. Eleanor found herself drawn to the site not to oversee, but to observe. She would sit on a stone bench at a respectful distance, a book open but unread in her lap, watching as his strong, careful hands shaped the structure. It was not just his skill that captivated her, but his quiet dignity, the focused intelligence in his eyes as he measured and planed. One afternoon, a sudden summer downpour sent her scrambling for the cover of the half-built gazebo. James was there, hastily covering his tools with a canvas sheet. They stood together in the confined space, the drumming of rain on the fresh-scented pine roof the only sound. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and sawdust. It was James who broke the silence, not with the deference of a servant, but with the simple observation of one human to another, commenting on the suddenness of the storm. His voice was low and melodic, his words thoughtful. Surprised, Eleanor responded, and a conversation began. Tentative at first about the weather, the garden, the books she pretended to read. That single, rain-soaked conversation became a secret thread connecting their solitary lives. They began to meet in the garden during the quiet hours of the late afternoon, when the light was golden and the household was occupied. Their encounters were always brief, always clandestine. A stolen 5 minutes here, a shared glance there. They spoke of things Eleanor had never dared voice. Her love for poetry, her childhood dreams, the stifling nature of her existence. James, in turn, spoke carefully, his words measured to avoid any danger. Yet he revealed a world of thought and feeling she had never imagined in a man held in bondage. He spoke of patterns in would grain like rivers on a map, of the mathematics of a sturdy joint, of the stories his own father had told him under a different sky. Eleanor was drawn to him, a moth to a forbidden flame. It was his kindness, a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to Robert's cold indifference. It was his intelligence, a sharp, perceptive mind that saw the world, and her with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying. In his presence, the hollow ache inside her began to fill with something warm and terrifyingly real. The carefully constructed walls of her life, built on obedience and appearance, began to crumble. One evening, as fireflies began to blink in the deepening twilight, they stood by the completed gazebo. The scent of jasmine was overpowering. He had just finished carving a small, intricate rose into the newel post, a detail not in the original plans. His work was done. The reason for their meetings was gone. A profound sense of loss, more acute than any she had felt before, washed over Eleanor. Without thinking, driven by a need she could no longer suppress, she reached out and laid her hand over his where it rested on the carved wood. His skin was warm and rough. He went very still, his breath catching. He turned his hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with her soft, gloved ones. It was an electric, impossible contact, a bridge across a chasm of law and custom. In the violet half-light, his eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not the caution of a slave, but the raw, unguarded yearning of a man. The world, the plantation, her marriage, the entire oppressive weight of Alabama, fell away. There was only the pounding of her heart, the scent of jasmine and pine, and the terrifying, exhilarating sense of falling. As the last light faded, he leaned in, and the space between them vanished. Their first kiss a silent, seismic act of defiance that would forever split her life into before and after. The secret, once a tender, stolen thing, quickly became a leaden weight in Eleanor's belly. The first wave of nausea, the sudden, profound fatigue. She recognized the signs with a dawning horror that eclipsed any joy. The world, which had briefly bloomed with color in James's presence, now constricted to a single, terrifying reality. She was carrying his child. In the stark confines of her bedroom, she pressed her hands against her still flat stomach, feeling the ghost of a future that promised only ruin. The scent of jasmine from the garden, once so intoxicating, now made her sick with fear. Every glance from a housemaid felt like an accusation. Every casual inquiry from Robert about her health a potential inquisition. She managed to steal a moment with James near the woodpile at the edge of the property, the air sharp with the smell of fresh-cut pine. Her whispered confession hung between them, a sentence of doom. The light she had always seen in his eyes, that quiet, resilient intelligence, flickered and was replaced by a raw, primal fear she had never witnessed there before. His strong hands, usually so steady, trembled as he reached for a log, not looking at her. His voice, when it came, was a low, desperate rasp. They were not just breaking a social code. They were defying the very foundation of their world, a crime for which the punishment would be swift, brutal, and absolute. Their plan was born of that desperation, a fragile, improbable web of lies. She would feign illness, use loosened corsets and strategic layers of clothing. The child, once born, would be secreted away, given to a story of a foundling, sent to a distant orphanage. Any story that would sever the visible tie and, they hoped, preserve their lives. But fate, it seemed, had a crueler sense of irony. The pains came on a night lashed by a violent spring storm, the thunder masking her cries. In the isolation of her room, with only a terrified, loyal housemaid for company, Eleanor labored in silent agony. And when the ordeal was over, there were not one, but two tiny, mewling infants, a boy and a girl, Samuel and Eliza. The miracle of their perfect, miniature features, the shocking blend of her pale skin and their father's distinct, beautiful curl to their hair, was utterly devastating. Their twin existence made their secret 100 times more volatile, a truth too big, too visible, to ever successfully hide. Robert's suspicion, once a dormant thing, sharpened into a blade. He was a man who understood property and bloodlines, and the whispers about his wife's withdrawn behavior and the oddity of a prolonged, secluded illness did not align. His eyes, cold and calculating, began to follow James. The connection, once invisible to him, now seemed to glow with damning evidence. The decision was made with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. There was no confrontation, no dramatic accusation. One morning, James was simply gone. Sold. A trader from Mississippi had passed through, and Robert had offered a price too good to refuse. The news was delivered to Eleanor by the overseer in the same tone he might use to report a broken plow. James was gone, erased from Oakwood as if he had never existed. His fate sealed on a distant plantation for a crime of love. The despair that descended upon Eleanor was a physical void, a darkness that swallowed all light. She moved through the days like a phantom, the cries of her infants the only sound that could pierce the numb shell of her grief. Kneeling on the floor of the nursery she had claimed for her convalescence, a twin cradled in each arm, she made a vow into the silent, watchful house. Her voice was a raw whisper, stripped of everything but a ferocious, burning resolve. She would not let them be taken. She would not let them be erased as their father had been. They were all that remained of James, all that was real and true in her life of lies. She would protect them, hide them, and keep them with her, no matter the cost. The opulent bedroom became a cage, the grand house a fortress, and her heart, once capable of such tender love, began to forge itself into an instrument of pure, desperate resilience. The roots of the attic's secret were now buried deep in this fertile soil of loss, a mother's love twisted into a vow that would demand everything. The world of Samuel and Eliza was a kingdom of dust motes and slanting light, a realm bounded by four walls and the low, sloping ceiling of the attic. For them, the faint scuff of their mother's slippers on the staircase was the trumpets heralding the queen's arrival, and the single, grimy window was a magical portal to a universe they could only imagine. Their days were not marked by the rising and setting of the sun in the open sky, but by the shifting patch of gold that traveled across the floorboards, a slow, silent sundial they used to time their games and measure their small lives. Samuel, at 8, was the cartographer of their confined world. He had created a detailed map of the attic on a scrap of parchment Eleanor had smuggled up, inscribing the locations of the whispering corner, where the floorboards groaned most musically, the dragon's lair beneath the heaviest trunk, and the most precious territory of all. The seeing cracks, these were the thin gaps between the wallboards, their spy holes to the world below. He would press his eye to the largest one, his body still with concentration, and report his findings to Eliza in a hushed, reverent tone. He described the emerald sweep of the lawn, the dizzying flight of swallows, and the distant, fascinating figures of people who moved with a freedom he could not comprehend. He saw other children sometimes, their laughter a faint, haunting melody carried on the wind, and a strange, hollow ache would bloom in his chest. Eliza, all of 6 years with a spirit as untamed as her riot of curls, lived in a world of more immediate enchantment. Her rag doll, Annabelle, was a constant companion, a confidant for all her secret questions. "Why can't we go down, Annabelle?" she would whisper, her breath stirring the doll's yarn hair. "Why is our kingdom so quiet?" She fashioned gowns for her from scraps of velvet and silk Eleanor brought, her small fingers stitching intricate patterns by the dim light. She did not map the attic. She populated it. The shadows were not mere absences of light but shy forest spirits, and the scurrying of a mouse in the walls was a messenger from a far-off land. Yet, even in her imagination, the questions lingered, formless and persistent as the dust. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, a memory would surface in Samuel's mind, vague and dreamlike. It was the memory of a man with strong, warm hands and a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, a voice that had sung to him, a scent of pine shavings and sunshine. He held onto these fragments, polishing them in his mind like rare stones. He never spoke of them to Eliza, sensing instinctively that they were a secret within their secret, a treasure too fragile for words. They were his only inheritance from the ghost he knew, in some deep, unspoken way, was his father. Their games were elaborate, silent pantomimes of the lives they observed through the cracks. They held grand, voiceless balls, bowing and twirling to music only they could hear. They sailed to distant lands on the raft of an old rug, Samuel navigating by the stars he had read about in his books, Eliza leaning over the edge to spot sea monsters in the dusty shadows. But every game was punctuated by the reality of their confinement. A sudden footstep from the house below would freeze them mid-motion, their playthings clutched tight, their eyes wide and fearful. The innocent joy of their imaginary world was forever shadowed by the necessity of silence, a constant, unspoken understanding that their very existence was a transgression. The emotional toll of this secrecy was a subtle weight that bowed their small shoulders. Samuel's thoughtful gaze often held a gravity that belonged to a much older boy, a silent burden of knowing. Eliza's questions, once simple curiosities, were now tinged with a plaintive confusion. "Are we bad, Samuel?" she had asked once after their mother had fled the attic in a panic, her voice small and wounded. He had no answer, only a fierce, protective urge to shield her from the truth he himself could not fully grasp. Their world, for all its imagined splendor, was built upon a foundation of fear, their innocence a flickering candle in the profound darkness of their hidden lives, a stark contrast to the vibrant, sun-drenched freedom that lay just beyond the locked door and the cracked, grimy window. The fragile equilibrium of Eleanor's double life began to fracture under the weight of a husband's dormant attention finally stirring. Robert Montgomery, a man who typically viewed his wife as part of the plantation's tranquil scenery, found his gaze sharpening, drawn to the small inconsistencies that had always been there but were now aligning into a pattern of profound disturbance. He noticed the way Eleanor's chair sat empty during the long evenings, her absence explained with vague murmurs of headaches or fatigue. He began to mark the precise hour she would retreat from the parlor, her movements a little too swift, her demeanor a little too tense. The perfect facade of Oakwood was developing hairline cracks, and Robert, a man of business who understood that cracks inevitably led to collapse, felt a slow, cold curiosity uncoil within him. It was the sounds that truly anchored his suspicion. Lying awake in the oppressive silence of the master bedroom, he would hear it. Not the scuttling of rats he'd initially dismissed, but a soft, rhythmic creaking from directly above, a sound like the pacing of a restless animal. One night, emboldened by a glass of brandy, he confronted her. He did not raise his voice. His tone was that of a man analyzing a flawed column in his account books. He stood in the doorway of her sitting room, his large frame blocking the light from the hall, and mentioned the odd noises from the attic, his eyes fixed on her face. Eleanor, caught mending one of Samuel's small shirts, felt the blood drain from her cheeks. Her fingers stilled, the needle poised like a weapon against her own thumb. She crafted a lie about a family of raccoons that had taken up residence, her voice a studied calm that belied the frantic hammering of her heart. She spoke of the difficulty of dislodging them, of the damage they might cause. Robert listened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those cool, assessing eyes, remained on her, and she knew he did not believe a word. While Robert's suspicion grew from a place of proprietary violation, another, more dangerous kind of attention was brewing in the quarters. Sarah, a woman whose own history was deeply entwined with the secret of the attic, had begun to notice things. She had cared for James before he was sold, had seen the way he and the mistress looked at one another in the stolen moments they believed were unseen. She had heard the whispers of the twin births, the story of the prolonged illness that didn't quite ring true. Lately, her duties cleaning the main house's upper hallway had brought her near the hidden staircase. She had seen the scuff marks on the floorboards that led to the tapestry, had heard, or thought she heard, the faint, muffled sound of a child's laughter from behind the wall. A deep, maternal curiosity, mixed with a bitter grief for James, took root in her heart. She began leaving small, anonymous gifts at the base of the hidden door. A smooth, river-washed stone, a cluster of wild blackberries wrapped in a leaf, a little corn-husk doll. They were offerings of recognition, a silent testament to a truth she felt pressing against the walls of the great house. She left them in the deep of night, her movements as silent as a shadow, a quiet rebellion against the enforced ignorance that governed their lives. The discovery of a perfectly round, white quartz stone just inside the tapestry one morning sent a jolt of pure terror through Eleanor. It was not random. It was a message. Her paranoia, once a diffuse cloud, now had a focal point. She watched the enslaved women with new, frantic eyes, and it was Sarah's quiet, knowing demeanor that stood out. The way her gaze would sometimes drift toward the ceiling, the lack of surprise in her eyes when Eleanor issued a sharp, unnecessary order. The confrontation happened in the linen closet, a cramped space smelling of soap and lavender. Eleanor cornered her, her voice a low, desperate hiss, demanding to know what she was doing. Sarah did not cower. She met Eleanor's frantic gaze with a calm that was more frightening than any defiance. Her hands continued folding a sheet, the movements slow and deliberate. She did not admit to anything, but her words were laced with a meaning that chilled Eleanor to the bone. She spoke of James, of his kindness, of how some truths were too heavy to stay buried forever. She mentioned a mother's love, and how it could make a person see things others were blind to. She never said the words, "I know," but the knowledge hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Eleanor stood frozen, the basket of linens in her arms feeling like a shield made of paper. She was faced with an impossible choice: to trust this woman who held the power to destroy everything with a single word, or to see her as a threat that must be silenced, a betrayal that could seal all their fates. The tension in the air was a physical force, the scales of her precarious world trembling, poised to tip into chaos. The first sign of the unraveling was a sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to bleed from the very walls of Oakwood after midnight. It was not the shriek of a bobcat or the complaint of old timber settling. It was a human sound, thin and reedy, a child's cry of fear or loneliness that the attic could no longer contain. Eleanor, lying rigid in her bed, felt the sound like a physical blow. Down the hall, Robert stirred, his own sleep fractured by the eerie noise. The next morning, the household was abuzz with a nervous energy. A silver candlestick was found misplaced in the library, a vase of flowers slightly askew on a hallway table, small, inexplicable disturbances that were the work of small, curious hands during a moment of brave exploration, but which to the servants seemed like the work of a ghost. Robert's patience, worn thin by weeks of suspicion, finally snapped over breakfast. His fist came down on the mahogany table, making the china rattle. He declared, in a voice that brooked no argument, that a full search of the house was to be conducted immediately, starting with the attic. He would rout out whatever vermin or mischief was causing this disruption. Eleanor's heart seized in her chest, a cold dread flooding her veins. The image of Samuel and Eliza, huddled and terrified as men tore open their hidden world, flashed behind her eyes. She forced her features into a mask of weary exasperation, laying a calming hand on his arm. Her voice was a study in practiced reason as she spun her lie, speaking of the recent influx of field rats, larger and bolder than usual, their scurrying and squeaking easily mistaken for something else in the dead of night. She spoke of the damage they could do to the stored linens and heirlooms, appealing to his sense of property. She suggested setting traps, a sensible, contained solution, her eyes pleading with him to see the logic, to not tear their home apart. For a long, tense moment, He stared at her, his jaw tight, but the sheer mundanity of her explanation, the lack of hysterics, won out. He grunted his assent, the search postponed, and Eleanor felt a wave of dizzying relief so potent she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. The reprieve was terrifyingly brief. That afternoon, as she ascended the hidden staircase with a tray of food, her foot had just touched the top step when a small, painted wooden horse, a toy she had brought Samuel weeks ago, tumbled from the folds of a blanket near the door and clattered down the steep, wooden stairs. The sound was appallingly loud in the silent house, a series of sharp, percussive knocks that echoed like gunshots. Below, in the main hallway, Robert's voice called out, sharp with inquiry. Frozen at the top, Eleanor watched in horror as the toy came to rest at the bottom, a blatant piece of evidence in the open. With a speed born of pure panic, she shoved the tray into the attic, whispered a frantic command for silence, and flew back down the stairs, snatching up the horse and hiding it in the pocket of her apron just as Robert rounded the corner. Her explanation was breathless, a story of dropping a hairbrush, her face flushed with a fear he mistook for irritation at her own clumsiness. He eyed her for a long moment before turning away, but the doubt in his eyes was a deeper, more permanent stain than before. Inside the attic, she found Samuel trembling, his small face pale with guilt and terror. Eliza was crying silent tears into her doll's dress. The fragile world they had built was shaken to its core. Eleanor gathered them into her arms, their small bodies trembling against hers. She rocked them, humming a lullaby her own mother had sung, her voice a fragile vessel of comfort in the storm. She whispered reassurances, promises of safety that felt like ashes in her mouth, her fingers stroking their hair. She soothed their fears with a mother's touch, but her own anxiety was a wild, clawing thing trapped inside her ribcage. The deception, once a heavy cloak she wore, now felt as insubstantial as smoke. A dropped toy, a misplaced candlestick, a cry in the night. These were the tiny fissures through which her entire world could now shatter. Holding her children in the dusty twilight, Eleanor Montgomery understood that the walls of her secret were paper-thin, and the wind was beginning to howl. The world outside the carriage window was a blur of vibrant green and gold, the Alabama summer at its most boastful, but inside, Eleanor Montgomery sat encased in a private winter. The journey back from Montgomery had been a trial of forced smiles and hollow pleasantries, a performance for a traveling companion who had since departed at the last crossroads. Now, alone but for the stoic driver, the silence was a vast, empty plain where her anxieties could run wild. The carriage slowed to a halt before the grand steps of Oakwood, the familiar sight offering no comfort. As the driver handed her down, a man on a lathered horse approached, a traveler with the dust of distant roads clinging to his boots and the weary look of one who carried news for coin. He tipped his hat, his eyes avoiding hers as he spoke to the overseer who had come to greet them. Eleanor, gathering her skirts to ascend the steps, caught the tail end of the conversation, a few murmured words that sliced through the humid air with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The fever took him down on the Blackwood place in Mississippi. The carpenter, James was his name, buried there last month. The words were simple, factual, but they struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. The world did not tilt. It simply stopped. The lush green of the lawn, the blinding white of the columns, the deep blue of the sky, all of it drained of color and meaning, receding into a gray, muffled distance. The sound of the cicadas, a moment ago a deafening roar, faded into a high-pitched hum in her ears. She did not remember moving, did not feel her feet carrying her across the marble foyer and up the grand staircase. Her body was a numb, heavy shell operating on a forgotten instinct. She bypassed her own rooms, her destination a single, fixed point in the universe, the hidden door behind the tapestry. Her hands, cold and clumsy, fumbled with the key, the metallic scrape a foreign sound in the profound silence that had enveloped her. She pushed the door open and stumbled into the attic, the familiar scent of dust and confinement now smelling of the grave. Samuel and Eliza looked up from their quiet game, their faces brightening at her unexpected arrival, but the light in their eyes dimmed as they saw hers. Eleanor did not speak. She could not form words around the jagged rock of grief lodged in her throat. She simply sank to her knees on the rough floorboards, the fine silk of her dress pooling around her like a wilted flower. A tremor started deep within her, a seismic shock that built until her entire body was racked with silent, violent sobs. She buried her face in her hands, but the tears came anyway, hot and relentless, carving paths through the powder on her cheeks and dripping onto the dusty wood. The children watched, frozen and bewildered by this raw, terrifying display of an emotion they had never seen in their always composed mother. Samuel was the first to move, his small hand coming to rest tentatively on her shaking shoulder. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice small in the face of her immense sorrow. It was that single word, that fragile anchor, that finally broke the dam of her silence. She lifted her head, her face a ravaged mask of pain. Her voice, when it came, was a broken, raw thing, stripped of all its cultured grace. "Your father," she choked out, the words barely audible. "My James, he is gone." She did not need to explain the finality of the word. Gone, the truth of it was etched into every line of her anguished face. Samuel's small body went rigid. The vague, dreamlike memories of warm hands and a rumbling voice solidified into a single, crushing reality. The ghost he had quietly cherished was now truly a ghost. His jaw tightened, his young face hardening into an expression of startling resolve. He did not cry. Instead, he looked at his weeping mother and his frightened sister, and a new, fierce weight settled onto his small shoulders. "I will be strong, Mama," he vowed, his voice low and steady, a man's promise in a child's timbre. "I will be strong for us, for him." His words, meant to comfort, only plunged Eleanor's guilt to new, unimaginable depths. It was her love that had doomed James to that distant plantation, her secrets that now forced her son to become a man before his time. The grief was a fire, and her guilt was the fuel, the two combining into a white-hot determination that burned away the last vestiges of her hesitation. She pulled both children to her, holding them so tightly she feared she might break them. She would protect them. She would keep them safe. It was all that was left. The last tether to a world of tenderness and hope had been severed with a traveler's casual words, and in its place grew a cold, hard resolve, a mother's love curdling into a desperate, all-consuming obsession, even as the foundations of her own mind began to crack under the unbearable weight. The storm did not approach Oakwood. It fell upon it with the fury of a vengeful god. Thunder cracked the sky open, and rain lashed the white columns and manicured lawns with a violence that felt personal. Inside the great house, the wind was a screaming thing, rattling window panes and moaning in the chimneys. For Eleanor, pacing the parlor, each peal of thunder was a hammer blow to her already frayed nerves. Her thoughts were not on the potential damage to the crops or the roof, but on the single vulnerable point in her entire world, the attic's lone window and its fragile wooden shutter. Up in their hidden kingdom, the storm was an apocalyptic event. Samuel huddled with Eliza in the farthest, darkest corner, their arms wrapped tightly around each other as the world outside their thin walls roared and shook. The single candle Eleanor had left them guttered and died, plunging them into a darkness broken only by blinding flashes of lightning. With each brilliant, terrifying illumination, the attic's familiar shadows twisted into monstrous shapes. It was during one such deafening crack of thunder, a sound that seemed to split the house in two, that the inevitable happened. A ferocious gust of wind found a weakness in the old wood, and the shutter on the attic window tore loose from its rusted hinges with a sickening splintering sound. The window swung violently inward, and the storm poured into the room. A deluge of rain, a shrieking gale, and a blinding, chaotic light. Eliza, her small body taut with terror, could no longer contain her fear. A single, high-pitched cry of "Mama" was torn from her lips, a desperate, child's plea that was carried on the howling wind, down from the attic and out into the storm-ravaged night. Eleanor, standing frozen in the parlor below, heard it. It was not loud, but it was unmistakable. A human voice, a child's voice, cutting through the cacophony of the storm. Her blood turned to ice. A moment later, a frantic pounding echoed from the front door. Peering through the rain-streaked glass, she saw the bulky, oilskin-clad figure of their nearest neighbor, Mr. Peterson. His face concerned as he gestured wildly toward the side of the house where the sound had seemed to originate. Her mind, honed by years of deception, moved with a cold, frantic clarity. There was no time for panic, only for the performance of a lifetime. She wrenched the door open, the wind snatching at her dress. Before he could speak, she clutched a hand to her chest, her face a mask of maternal distress. "Mr. Peterson, thank heavens you heard it too," she cried, her voice pitched to carry over the storm. "It's the most pitiful sound, a kitten, I'm sure of it. The storm must have driven it up into the eaves. The poor, stranded creature. Its cries are breaking my heart." She poured every ounce of convincing fear into her story, her eyes wide and pleading. She spoke of a tiny, imagined gray kitten she'd seen around the property, weaving just enough detail to root the lie in reality. Mr. Peterson, a practical man more concerned with livestock than felines, was momentarily disarmed by her apparent distress. He offered to fetch a ladder, but Eleanor insisted it was too dangerous in the storm, that she would not have him risk his neck for a cat. She promised to have a stable hand see to it at first light. Her performance was flawless, a masterclass in misdirection, and after a few more reassurances, the bewildered neighbor retreated back into the tempest. The moment the door closed, Eleanor was a woman possessed. She did not wait. Snatching a hammer and nails from a hall closet, she flew up the main staircase and then the hidden one, her heart a wild drum in her chest. The scene in the attic was one of pure devastation. Rain blew in sheets through the open window, soaking the floor and the children's few belongings. Samuel was trying vainly to hold the shattered shutter against the frame, his small body battered by the wind, while Eliza wept hysterically in the corner. Without a word, Eleanor fought her way to the window. Her hands, usually so graceful, were strong and sure as she wrestled the broken wood into place. The hammer blows were fierce, desperate strikes, each nail driven not just into the frame, but into the coffin of her old life of passive secrecy. She was not just repairing a shutter. She was barricading them all against a world that had come terrifyingly close to discovering them. When the last nail was sunk and the storm was locked out once more, she turned. The adrenaline faded, leaving her trembling and weak. She went to the children, gathering their soaked, shivering forms into her arms. She sank to the wet floor, cradling them, her own tears finally mingling with the rain on their faces. She rocked them, whispering promises into their hair, her voice raw with a newfound ferocity. "Hush, my darlings, hush. I am here. No one will take you from me. Never. We will never be separated. I promise you." The words were a vow, a line drawn in the sand. The close call had stripped away the last of her hesitation. The stakes were no longer about maintaining a facade. They were about survival. As she held her terrified children in the storm's aftermath, Eleanor Montgomery knew that the time for mere hiding was over. Drastic measures were no longer a possibility. They were an inevitability, and the near discovery had just lit the fuse. The arrival of Sheriff Turner's horse was a different kind of storm, one of dust and deliberate authority rather than wind and rain. He rode up the long oak-lined drive of Oakwood with a slow, measured pace, his eyes missing nothing: the neat rows of cotton, the quiet efficiency of the workers in the fields, the imposing, pristine facade of the big house itself. His visit was framed in the language of civic duty, a routine check on the welfare of the enslaved laborers, a practice he was known to perform with a stern but fair hand. Yet the undercurrent of his presence was a cold, probing river fed by the whispers that had been trickling into town for weeks. Strange noises, a mistress who seemed perpetually on edge, and a story about a kitten in a storm that hadn't quite rung true. Eleanor watched his approach from the parlor window, her body rigid. The sight of the star-shaped badge pinned to his leather vest was a focal point for all her fears, a symbol of the world's judgment made manifest. She smoothed her dress with hands that threatened to tremble, drawing a deep, steadying breath that did little to calm the frantic flutter in her chest. Behind her, Robert's demeanor was a study in contrast. He greeted the sheriff at the door with an almost eager hospitality, his voice booming with a forced heartiness. Here was a man of the law, an authority figure, and Robert, who valued order above all things, saw his arrival not as a threat, but as a potential ally in rooting out whatever irregularity was plaguing his home. The sheriff accepted a glass of lemonade in the parlor, his gaze sweeping the room with a polite but penetrating curiosity. He directed his initial questions at Robert, inquiries about the harvest, the general health of the workers, the state of the quarters. Robert answered everything with expansive cooperation, offering to show him the account books, the storehouses, anything he wished to see. All the while, the sheriff's eyes would drift back to Eleanor, who sat silently in her chair, a statue of composed femininity. He noted the unnatural stillness of her hands in her lap, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the faint, tense line of her jaw. When he turned his questions to her, they were deceptively gentle. He asked about the management of the household, the disposition of the domestic staff. Eleanor's answers were precise, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of calm. She spoke of routines and responsibilities, her words like smooth, polished stones placed deliberately in a stream. But when he casually mentioned having heard about some unsettling noises from other plantations, a subtle shift occurred. A veil seemed to drop behind her eyes, a subtle withdrawal. She offered the practice story of the raccoons and the recent rat infestation, but her explanation was just a little too quick, her gaze flickering toward the ceiling for a fraction of a second before returning to his face. It was that single, fleeting glance, a nervous tick born of a mother's primal fear, that the sheriff's keen eyes did not miss. He filed it away, a piece of a puzzle that was beginning to take a disturbing shape. Robert, oblivious to the silent exchange, enthusiastically agreed to a tour of the grounds. As they moved from the house toward the outbuildings, Eleanor walked slightly ahead, her role as the gracious hostess now a strategic weapon. She guided the sheriff's attention with a deft hand, pointing out the new smokehouse, the thriving kitchen garden, the recently whitewashed fences. She steered the conversation and his path away from the main house, away from the side where the faded tapestry hid its secret. Her chatter was a shimmering curtain, drawn to obscure the one door she could not let him see. The sheriff played his part, nodding, commenting on the plantation's obvious prosperity. But his mind was working, correlating the evasiveness of the mistress with the husband's oblivious cooperation, the strange rumors with the almost imperceptible tension that vibrated in the air around Eleanor Montgomery. His inspection of the quarters was thorough but yielded nothing out of the ordinary. The workers, sensing the gravity of his presence, offered only respectful, formulaic answers. As he prepared to leave, mounting his horse once more, he offered his thanks, his tone as polite as when he had arrived. But his final glance toward the grand house was not one of admiration. It was the look of a man who knew he was being lied to, who had seen the careful cracks in a beautiful vase and knew it was only a matter of time before it shattered. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode back down the drive, leaving behind him not answers, but a thickening cloud of impending doom. The net of suspicion, once woven of distant whispers, had now been cast by an official hand, and it was drawing tight around Oakwood, its silken threads feeling more and more like steel. The scent of fried chicken and peach pie should have been comforting, a familiar perfume of southern summer, but to Eleanor, it was the smell of a battlefield. The community picnic on the sprawling lawn of the Covington estate was a tableau of pastoral ease, a scene of women in wide-brimmed hats fanning themselves and men discussing cotton prices in the dappled shade. Children shrieked with laughter as they chased fireflies in the gathering twilight, their freedom a stark, painful contrast to the silent confinement of her own. Eleanor moved through the crowd, a plate of untouched food in her hand, her smile a fragile shield against the probing glances she felt like physical touches. She was a ship navigating a sea of pleasantries, every ripple of conversation a potential wave that could capsize her. It was Martha who finally breached the hull. She cornered Eleanor near the lemonade table, her kind face etched with a concern that felt more dangerous than any accusation. "Eleanor, my dear," she began, her voice low and confidential. "We are all so worried about you." She leaned in closer, the scent of rosewater on her skin. "These ailments of yours, these long confinements. It isn't natural for a woman of your constitution. Are you certain there is nothing more troubling you?" The word ailments hung in the air, laced with a new, insidious meaning. It was no longer a reference to headaches or fatigue, but a public label for her private torment. Martha's eyes were soft, but they were searching, picking at the threads of Eleanor's composure. The picnic, with its veneer of communal harmony, had become an inquisition, and the verdict was written in the worried frowns of her neighbors. The carriage ride home was a silent, suffocating journey. Robert sat opposite her, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the darkening landscape outside the window. The tension between them was a physical presence, thick and electric. The moment the oakwood door closed behind them, sealing them in the tomb-like silence of the foyer, he turned on her. He did not shout. His voice was low, cold, and precise, each word a chip of ice. "The sheriff's visit. Martha's prying. The whispers that follow this house like a bad smell," he stated, his eyes boring into hers. "I am not a fool, Eleanor. There is a secret in this house, a sickness, and it emanates from you." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the dim light. "I will have the truth. What are you hiding in the attic?" The directness of the question, the mention of the attic, was a blade to her heart. She stood frozen, her mind scrambling for a lie, any lie, but the words turned to dust in her mouth. She could only stare at him, her silence a more damning confession than any answer she could have given. The confrontation was left hanging, a sword suspended over her head, as Robert turned and retreated to his study, the slam of the door a final, brutal punctuation. The house settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the frantic beating of Eleanor's heart. It was in this heavy silence that she heard it, a faint, ragged cough from above, followed by a low, pained moan. Her blood ran cold. She flew up the hidden staircase, her fear of Robert momentarily eclipsed by a more primal terror. In the attic, she found Samuel curled on his thin pallet, his skin burning with a fever that radiated heat in the stuffy room. His breathing was a shallow, wheezing rattle, and his eyes were glazed with sickness. Eliza hovered nearby, her small face pale with fear, clutching her doll like a talisman. The sight of him, so small and helpless, ignited a fresh, more potent panic. This was not a mystery or a social transgression. This was her child, and he was ill. The carefully stocked medicine chest was in the main house, down the hall from Robert's study. To fetch it was to dance with the devil himself. Waiting until the deep of night, when the house was steeped in what she prayed was a profound sleep, she became a ghost in her own home. Each floorboard was a potential traitor, each creak a thunderclap in the silence. She moved with an agonizing slowness, her ears straining for any sound from Robert's room. The journey to the medicine chest in the upstairs hallway felt like a mile. Her fingers closed around a bottle of fever tonic, the glass cool against her sweating palm. On her return journey, a shadow moved at the end of the hall. Robert, emerging from his study, a glass of brandy in his hand. He stopped, his eyes narrowing in the gloom, peering down the corridor directly at her. Eleanor froze, the bottle clutched behind her back, her body pressed against the wall. The moment stretched into an eternity, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. He took a half-step forward, his head cocked, and then, with a grunt of dismissal, he turned and disappeared back into his study. She did not breathe until the click of his door latch echoed in the hall. Back in the attic, she administered the tonic to Samuel with trembling hands, soothing his fevered brow with a damp cloth. As she watched his labored breathing slowly even out, the full weight of the night crashed down upon her. The public speculation, Robert's confrontation, the heart-stopping terror of nearly being caught. It was a cascade of failures. She looked from Samuel's sickly face to Eliza's trusting one, and the truth, cold and undeniable, settled in her bones. This could not continue. The lie was a house of cards in a hurricane, and she was running out of hands to hold it up. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here, raging within the very walls of Oakwood, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that she could not maintain the deception much longer. The scent of fried chicken and peach pie should have been comforting, a familiar perfume of southern summer, but to Eleanor, it was the smell of a battlefield. The community picnic on the sprawling lawn of the Covington estate was a tableau of pastoral ease. A scene of women in wide-brimmed hats fanning themselves and men discussing cotton prices in the dappled shade. Children shrieked with laughter as they chased fireflies in the gathering twilight, their freedom a stark, painful contrast to the silent confinement of her own. Eleanor moved through the crowd, a plate of untouched food in her hand, her smile a fragile shield against the probing glances she felt like physical touches. She was a ship navigating a sea of pleasantries, every ripple of conversation a potential wave that could capsize her. It was Martha who finally breached the hull. She cornered Eleanor near the lemonade table, her kind face etched with a concern that felt more dangerous than any accusation. "Eleanor, my dear," she began, her voice low and confidential. "We are all so worried about you." She leaned in closer, the scent of rosewater on her skin. "These ailments of yours, these long confinements. It isn't natural for a woman of your constitution. Are you certain there is nothing more troubling you?" The word ailments hung in the air, laced with a new, insidious meaning. It was no longer a reference to headaches or fatigue, but a public label for her private torment. Martha's eyes were soft, but they were searching, picking at the threads of Eleanor's composure. The picnic, with its veneer of communal harmony, had become an inquisition, and the verdict was written in the worried frowns of her neighbors. The carriage ride home was a silent, suffocating journey. Robert sat opposite her, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the darkening landscape outside the window. The tension between them was a physical presence, thick and electric. The moment the Oakwood door closed behind them, sealing them in the tomb-like silence of the foyer, he turned on her. He did not shout. His voice was low, cold, and precise, each word a chip of ice. "The sheriff's visit. Martha's prying. The whispers that follow this house like a bad smell," he stated, his eyes boring into hers. "I am not a fool, Eleanor. There is a secret in this house, a sickness, and it emanates from you." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the dim light. "I will have the truth. What are you hiding in the attic?" The directness of the question, the mention of the attic, was a blade to her heart. She stood frozen, her mind scrambling for a lie, any lie, but the words turned to dust in her mouth. She could only stare at him, her silence a more damning confession than any answer she could have given. The confrontation was left hanging, a sword suspended over her head, as Robert turned and retreated to his study, the slam of the door a final, brutal punctuation. The house settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the frantic beating of Eleanor's heart. It was in this heavy silence that she heard it, a faint, ragged cough from above, followed by a low, pained moan. Her blood ran cold. She flew up the hidden staircase, her fear of Robert momentarily eclipsed by a more primal terror. In the attic, she found Samuel curled on his thin pallet, his skin burning with a fever that radiated heat in the stuffy room. His breathing was a shallow, wheezing rattle, and his eyes were glazed with sickness. Eliza hovered nearby, her small face pale with fear, clutching her doll like a talisman. The sight of him, so small and helpless, ignited a fresh, more potent panic. This was not a mystery or a social transgression. This was her child, and he was ill. The carefully stocked medicine chest was in the main house, down the hall from Robert's study. To fetch it was to dance with the devil himself. Waiting until the deep of night, when the house was steeped in what she prayed was a profound sleep, she became a ghost in her own home. Each floorboard was a potential traitor, each creak a thunderclap in the silence. She moved with an agonizing slowness, her ears straining for any sound from Robert's room. The journey to the medicine chest in the upstairs hallway felt like a mile. Her fingers closed around a bottle of fever tonic, the glass cool against her sweating palm. On her return journey, a shadow moved at the end of the hall. Robert, emerging from his study, a glass of brandy in his hand. He stopped, his eyes narrowing in the gloom, peering down the corridor directly at her. Eleanor froze, the bottle clutched behind her back, her body pressed against the wall. The moment stretched into an eternity, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. He took a half-step forward, his head cocked, and then, with a grunt of dismissal, he turned and disappeared back into his study. She did not breathe until the click of his door latch echoed in the hall. Back in the attic, she administered the tonic to Samuel with trembling hands, soothing his fevered brow with a damp cloth. As she watched his labored breathing slowly even out, the full weight of the night crashed down upon her. The public speculation, Robert's confrontation, the heart-stopping terror of nearly being caught. It was a cascade of failures. She looked from Samuel's sickly face to Eliza's trusting one, and the truth, cold and undeniable, settled in her bones. This could not continue. The lie was a house of cards in a hurricane, and she was running out of hands to hold it up. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here, raging within the very walls of Oakwood, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that she could not maintain the deception much longer. Guilt was a slow poison, and for Sarah, it had been working its way through her veins for years. It festered in the quiet moments, fed by the memory of James's gentle hands and the knowledge of his lonely death in a foreign field. That guilt curdled into a sharp, bitter anger as she watched the mistress of the house move through her days with a frantic, haunted grace. Her secret festering in the attic while the man who had helped create it was forgotten dust. The breaking point came in the sweltering heat of the laundry yard. Robert Montgomery passed by, his boots kicking up little clouds of red dust, and he paused to complain about a poorly mended fence post, his tone dripping with the casual contempt of a man discussing a broken tool. He mentioned James's name, not with regret, but with a dismissive sneer about the inferior quality of work he'd had to replace. Something inside Sarah snapped. The years of silence, of complicity, of watching the children she knew were up there grow pale in their dusty prison, boiled over into a white-hot rage. She dropped the wet sheet she was wringing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The words were out of her mouth before thought could stop them. A torrent of long-suppressed truth aimed directly at Robert's retreating back. She did not shout. Her voice was low, guttural, and more terrifying for its intensity. She spoke of the mistress's secret visits, of the whispers in the walls, of the truth Robert was too blind to see. She spat out the final, damning revelation, that the ghost in his attic was not a ghost at all, but two living, breathing children, his wife's children, the legacy of the man he had sold down the river. The world seemed to stop. The buzzing of the flies in the humid air fell silent. Robert turned back to her, his face a terrifying blank canvas for a moment before it transformed, the features twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The confirmation of his deepest, most humiliating suspicion did not bring clarity, only a volcanic rage. He did not speak a word to Sarah. He simply turned on his heel and stormed toward the big house, his long strides eating up the ground, his entire being focused on a single terrible destination. Inside, he was a force of nature, a hurricane of wrath contained in human form. He took the main staircase 2 steps at a time, the sound of his boots a violent drumbeat against the polished wood. He did not hesitate at the tapestry, simply tearing it from the wall with a brutal yank, the fabric ripping. The hidden door stood revealed. He did not bother with a key. He threw his full weight against it, the old reinforced lock splintering the frame with a sound like a gunshot. The door exploded inward, slamming against the attic wall. The scene that met his eyes was frozen in the sudden, violent intrusion of light from the hallway. Eleanor was kneeling on the floor, cradling Samuel's feverish head in her lap, a wet cloth in her hand. Eliza was pressed against her mother's side, her face a perfect O of terror. The air, thick with the scent of sickness and dust, was now charged with the electricity of catastrophe. For a single, suspended second, nobody moved. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a horror beyond fear. Samuel stirred weakly, his glazed eyes trying to focus on the monstrous silhouette filling the doorway. Eliza let out a small, choked whimper, burying her face in Eleanor's dress. Then the world crashed back in. Robert stood on the threshold, his chest heaving, his gaze sweeping over the shocking tableau. The sick, obviously mixed-race boy, the cowering girl, his wife in a posture of desperate maternal protection. The carefully constructed world of Oakwood Plantation, of his name and his honor, collapsed in that single silent confrontation. His rage was a physical heat radiating from him, a palpable force that seemed to suck the very air from the cramped room. It collided with the children's pure, animal terror and Eleanor's shattered defiance. A silent detonation that shattered 7 years of secrets, lies, and a mother's desperate love into a million irreparable pieces. The attic was no longer a secret. It was a crime scene, and the truth, ugly and undeniable, lay exposed at his feet. The silence that followed the splintering of the attic door was more deafening than any storm. It was the silence of a world breaking. Robert Montgomery did not utter a word. He simply stood there, a monolith of cold fury, his eyes sweeping over the damning evidence of his wife's transgression. The 2 children who were a living, breathing indictment of her betrayal and his own blindness. His gaze, when it finally landed on Eleanor, held no trace of the man she had known for years. It was the look of a stranger viewing a particularly repulsive specimen. He turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing with finality as he descended the stairs, leaving the torn tapestry fluttering like a ghost in his wake. The confrontation was over, but the annihilation had just begun. By morning, the sentence was delivered. Robert did not face her. The message came through the overseer, a man whose face was a mask of grim satisfaction. Eleanor Montgomery was disowned. She was to be removed from the main house, her name struck from the family Bible, her possessions, everything but the clothes on her back. Forfeit. She was no longer his wife. She was a contaminant to be excised. The news did not travel by post or polite messenger. It leaked from Oakwood like a poison, carried on the swift, scandalized breaths of servants and field hands, spreading through the town with the voracious speed of a wildfire in dry grass. The story was too salacious, too perfectly monstrous, to be contained. The refined plantation lady, the hidden mixed-race children, the cuckolded husband. Eleanor's carefully maintained facade was not just cracked. It was pulverized, and the town feasted on the rubble. By midday, the first stones were thrown. Not literal stones at first, but projectiles of pure communal hatred. A group of men, their faces flushed with righteous indignation and cheap whiskey, gathered at the end of the Oakline Drive. Their voices were a low, menacing growl that carried on the wind, demanding justice, demanding the abomination be cleansed from their community. They saw themselves as agents of moral purity, their hypocrisy cloaked in the language of divine law and social order. The woman they had once taken tea with was now a symbol of everything they feared and despised, a threat to the rigid hierarchy that defined their world. Eleanor, barred from the main house, had retreated to the only sanctuary she had left. She dragged a heavy trunk in front of the splintered attic door, barricading herself and her terrified children inside their former prison, which had now become their only fortress. Through the grimy window, she watched the mob swell. She saw the faces of men she had considered neighbors, their features twisted into ugly masks of rage. She heard the women she had called friends hissing vitriol from the safety of their carriages. The world had turned against her with a breathtaking swiftness, its judgment as harsh and unyielding as the Alabama sun. Inside the attic, Samuel and Eliza huddled in the darkest corner, their small bodies trembling. The world's fury was a tangible force, pressing in on the thin walls, and they understood, with the stark clarity of children, that they were the cause of it. Crouched on the dusty floor, her arms wrapped around her children, Eleanor faced the consequences of her actions. It was not just Robert's disownment or the mob's rage she faced, but the crushing weight of a society whose laws she had defied for love. The racism was not an abstract concept. It was in the torches being lit at the edge of the lawn, in the spit that would soon land on her door. The hypocrisy was in the eyes of the men in the mob, men who likely had their own half-hidden secrets in the slave quarters, men for whom her crime was not the act itself, but the audacity of loving openly enough to create a family, to cherish the children, to bring the hidden reality of their world into the light. As the shouts grew louder and the shadows of the mob lengthened across the lawn, Eleanor understood that her fight was no longer about hiding a secret. It was about surviving the brutal, unforgiving fallout of a truth the world was not ready to bear. The final, crushing blow was not the mob's rage or Robert's disownment, but the profound, chilling silence that fell over Oakwood the next morning. The shouting men had dispersed, their thirst for immediate violence tempered by the light of day and the sobering reality of the law, but their absence was not peace. It was the quiet of a grave. Eleanor knew the stillness was a lie. The sheriff would return, not with questions, but with warrants. Robert would not rest until every trace of her and the children was expunged. The attic, once a sanctuary and then a prison, was now a death trap. The barricaded door would not hold against the sanctioned force of the world that had condemned them. As the first rays of sun pierced the grimy window, illuminating the dust that danced over her children's sleeping forms, Eleanor's despair crystallized into a single, sharp point of resolve. There was only one choice left. They had to run. The plan was born of desperation and a single, tenuous thread of trust. Sarah, the woman whose anger had unmasked them, now held the only possible key to their salvation. Approaching her was a gamble that could end in betrayal and a swift, brutal end, but Eleanor had no other chips left to play. She waited until the deep of night, when the plantation was swathed in a moonless black, and slipped from the attic like a wraith. She found Sarah not in the quarters, but in the carpentry shed, sitting alone on a stack of lumber, her face illuminated by a single tallow candle. The scent of fresh-cut pine was a ghost of James, a painful reminder of all that had been lost. Sarah looked up as Eleanor entered, her expression not of surprise, but of grim expectation. There were no apologies offered, no explanations needed. The shared wreckage of their lives lay between them, and in that ruin, a new, desperate alliance was forged. Sarah's guilt had curdled into a fierce, protective determination. She knew the routes, the whispers, the hidden network of souls who believed in a different law than the one written in the plantation ledgers. The Underground Railroad could take them, she said. There was a safe house, a first stop on the long road north. It could be reached by dawn if they left now. The final moments in the attic were a silent, frantic ballet. There were no trunks, no keepsakes, only the clothes on their backs and a small pouch of food and coins Sarah provided. Eleanor woke Samuel and Eliza with a gentle hand, her finger to her lips. Their eyes, wide and fearful in the gloom, understood. This was not another game of silence. This was the real thing. They dressed quickly, their small hands trembling as they fastened buttons. Samuel, his fever broken but his body still weak, stood tall, trying to mimic the resolve he saw in his mother's face. Eliza clutched her rag doll, Annabelle, her tiny knuckles white. Eleanor took one last look around the room that had been their entire world. She saw the scuff marks on the floor from their games, the faint outlines of letters Samuel had traced in the dust, the crack in the wall that had been their window to a world they could never join. It was not a home. It was a relic of a life of fear, and leaving it felt like shedding a diseased skin. They moved through the sleeping property like shadows, Sarah leading the way with a hunter's knowledge of the land. They did not take the roads, but slipped through the dense, dark woods at the edge of the cotton fields, the thorns snagging at their clothes, the night creatures scattering at their passage. Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind of reflection, each step away from Oakwood a step deeper into the chasm of her past. She thought of her love for James, a feeling so pure it had felt like grace, yet it had sown the seeds of this relentless tragedy. She thought of her failures, the years of forcing her children to live as ghosts, the lies that had poisoned every corner of her soul, the love that had proven to be as much a cage as the attic itself. Yet, As she glanced back at their small, determined figures following behind her, that same love burned brighter than any regret. It was the one true thing in a life of falsehoods, the engine that would drive her forward. As a sliver of pink dawn lightened the eastern sky, a small, dilapidated cabin emerged from the mist, nestled in a hollow far from any main path. A single candle flickered in the window, a prearranged signal. This was the safe house. The moment of parting was swift and wordless. Sarah squeezed Eleanor's hand, a communication of shared pain and hard-won hope, and then melted back into the trees, a guardian spirit returning to the world of bondage. A woman with a weary, kind face opened the cabin door and ushered them inside without a sound. Standing on the threshold of the unknown, Eleanor took a final look back toward the south, toward Alabama and the life she was leaving behind. She felt no nostalgia, only a vast, hollowed-out space where her old self had been. A new vow formed in her heart, not of secrecy, but of rebuilding. She would find a place where her children could walk in the sun, where their names would not be a crime, where her love for them could be an open, unashamed thing. She turned her back on the past, her hands resting on Samuel and Eliza's shoulders, and stepped across the cabin's threshold into a future forged from the ashes of her failures. Behind them, miles away, the attic of Oakwood Plantation stood empty. The morning sun slanted through the grimy window, illuminating the abandoned toys, the dusty pallets, the lingering scent of fear and love. It was a hollow shell, a silent, haunting reminder of the secrets that had been buried there and the lives that had been forever changed within its confining walls. The only echoes left were those of a mother's love and the faint, fading whispers of children who were finally, blessedly, free.